Okay, so now that we are fetching the users from the dummy JSON API, what I now want to do is render the dummy JSON users into the chat sidebar. So we have the constant of fetch users in here. What I'm going to do is pass this down as props, and I'm going to call these props data of fetch users. So if we go into our chat sidebar component in here, I now want to create a type of props, and these props are going to go in here, and essentially it will be type props, and the props type in here is the data that we are receiving from the page component, and essentially it's the user type coming from dummy JSON API. So what I'm going to do is just bring in my types for that in here. So it is essentially the all user type that I'm going to call it, and if I bring that in and paste it in here, essentially there's quite a lot of strings and data that is coming from the dummy user. And if we call this all users type, we just need to import that in. And then I'm going to destructure the data because we need to use that now in here for our chats. And if we console log the data now, let's see what is being returned. So if we scroll all the way down, you can see here the data is undefined. That is because we need to save all of the pages because we are passing in the props from the page. So now you can see the data is being passed in. What we want is the object of users. So we need to destructure that. So let's go ahead and do that. So const the users is what we need to destructure from the data. So essentially destructuring is where we would pick out a certain thing from the data. So in our case, we want to pick out the users. So now in our chats under here, I want to do users.map. So we want to cycle through the users. And for each user, what I'm going to do is render a p tag. And in here, I'm going to get the user.name. What I also want to do is add a closing parentheses in here. And there are a few TypeScript errors, but we will fix those in a moment. If we refresh the page, we aren't receiving any users come through here. So let's double check why that is. So if we hover over users, it says it does not exist on all users type. So it might be undefined. So what we want to do is add optional chaining in here to say if there are users, then we want to map through it. So let's double check that. And again, that's not working. So what we want to do now is console log users to see if users is pulling through like so. And then let's save and check the console. So the users are pulling through, which is fine. As you can see there, they are pulling through. So all I want to do is I want to do a check before we map over the users to say if there are users. So we want to do user double bang and users, which means that it will convert whatever users is into a Boolean value. So if users is true and users.map, then we want to map over it. And the user is going to be of type all users type. And then the data here is going to be changed. So if we go back into our page, you can see the data is of type all users. So that's the type we need to do in our data being passed down into the props. So let's change that like so. So that cleaned up that error. And then finally, it's missing a key prop. So P and the key is going to be the user.id. And then it says name does not exist. So let's do email instead. So now there are no errors in the code. And if we save all, we should now get the chats being rendered in here. So we are getting the emails pulled through. So now what I want to do is create a reusable chat component so we can render out the relevant chats instead of this here. So let's go ahead and render a chat which takes in a key first of all. So that is the user.id, each user, and then I want to pass in data. So the data this time will be the user. So essentially all of the user being spread across, and then we just need to close this component off. Now, if I save, we now need to create a chat component. So let's go in here in the sidebar and create a new file called chat.tsx. And this time we are receiving props. So it's going to be tsrafce and tab like so. And we are receiving the props. So the props is going to be the data that we pass in, but the data this time is going to be the all users type as an object because we are already mapping through it. So this chat is essentially the UI that we are going to be rendering on the chat sidebar. And what I'm going to do is just quickly refactor this a little bit. So this is react.fc, which is a functional component which will receive props. And then we want to destructure the data that we pass into here. like so. And then if we go into chat sidebar, we just need to quickly import this from our components. Now that is being handled on the chat sidebar side. We just need to render the chat. So if we first of all render a p tag, and in here it's going to be data.email, just to see that the emails are still passing through and rendering correctly. So as you can see now that the emails are pulling through and we are rendering it correctly. So we just need to style it out a little bit and make sure it works correctly. So in here, I'm going to style the div out first of all. So div will have a class name. It will be flex. So display of flex, items of center. We will have the justify between and a py of 4, a px of 6. This is going to have a bg of white for each chat, and then a border bottom, which is border dash b, and then we also are going to have a border of gray, which is the shade of 400. So that is that set. So let's check if that works. Now you can see each chat is being rendered, and you can see it's essentially scrolling as well, which is good. And at the bottom, you can see your personal messages are encrypted, so that's fine. We also need to add styling for when we hover over it. So let's go ahead and do that with Tailwind. So the way to do that is all you do is type in hover and then colon like so. This will have a BG of gray 200, an opacity of 80, an overflow of hidden, and finally a cursor pointer. So now if we save and hover over, we know which chat we are hovering over essentially. So that section is complete. Inside the outer div now, I'm going to have another div. So div in here, this will have a class name of flex and justify items from the start. Items center, so align item center, and then we are going to have a gap of 4, which means give it a gap for each of the children inside. So now if I move this p tag into here, and the first thing I want to render is a image component from next image, and then we can pass in the relevant details. So we have a source. So the source is going to be data.image. So the avatar is going to instead be a user, a width of 50 and a height of 50. We also have a class name of rounded full. So if we save, there is an error in here. So JSX element does not support attributes because it doesn't have a props property. So what we want to do now is essentially import the image component from next image, and that error will go away. And let's see what is rendering on the UI. So now it says here invalid source prop. Hostname robohash.org is not configured. So this is where we need to configure the next config.js. So let's go ahead and copy this URL first of all. So this is normal with Next.js. So if we go into next config.js in here, I want to enhance the next config. So we need to define the next config first of all. And in here, we want the images. We want an images object, and you can have object of images with domains in here. So the URL that I've copied across, all I need to do now is paste that in as a string in here. And if there was more, you just do the same again and trail on from this. So now if I save all, what will happen now is I need to restart the application because I made changes to the next config. So if I do yarn run dev again, this error should now go away if we refresh the page. And as you can see now, we are getting our images being rendered on the page, which is correct and working fine. So now that that is working correctly, we can close this off. And then instead of data.email now, what I want to do is create a new div. And this div will have a class name. This is the text that's going to be on the right. And we are going to have flex col, which means display flex direction of column. And then we're going to have align items of start, which is item start. And then also justify of start. Then we're going to have a few p tags. So first p tag is going to be the data.firstname, which comes from the data that we are receiving from the props. The second thing we need is a p tag again. And for now, I'm just going to put in this is the message body as text because we don't have any messages coming from this API. So now if I save that, let's check that works, which it does do. And then I also want to add some styling in here. So the styling in here is going to be text gray of 500. And I also want to truncate. So this is the same as text ellipsis, but essentially it truncates the text if it exceeds the certain amount, which is going to be truncate, and it's going to have a width of a half. So let's do that and save in here. So now can you see here it truncates it if the message is too long. What will happen is we will replace this with the last message when we fetch the details and the data from Firebase. And then the final div I want to do is a timestamp. So let's quickly do a timestamp. And in the final div, what I want to do is a p tag, and I'm just going to put in 1039 in here. So if we save, I'm going to give the p text a class name, and this is going to be text gray of 500, and the text this time is going to be small. So let's give it a have a look. As you can see, that is working correctly, so that's fine. So now what I want to do is make this a little better and move this all the way to the end. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we need to do is create a new div and wrap these two divs within the outer div. So 1 and 2. This is going to have a class name of flex. So now we need to align the item centrally. So flex, and then items of center, and then justify of between. And now they are between. All I now need to do is give it a gap. So on the outer div, I'm just going to give a gap of 4. So now if we save and go in here, that looks a little better. So that is the sidebar pretty much complete. We are fetching the data, so we're getting the image and the name coming from the server side, and you can see that in our console logs over here. And now if we go into our chat sidebar, you can see here that the chats are now working, and that is in this piece of code here where we have created a reusable chat component. We're mapping through all of the users, and we have a chat component that renders out the relevant information. So now what we can do is delete this comment, and I believe that the chat sidebar is now complete. So what we will be doing next is we will install Firebase, and then we will create a Firebase project, and then we will also get some authentication in place as well.